Have you ever had someone walk up to you and say, "What are you talking about?" And you really don't want to say? Maybe you were in grade school and you were talking with your friend about what happened on the Brady Bunch last night, and the teacher says, "What are you two talking about? Would you like to share it with the whole class? Is it something that pertains to the math lesson?" And you don't want to tell them what you were talking about. Or maybe in high school you were talking with your friends and someone walks up and says, "What are you guys talking about?" And what you were talking about is the party that you're going to that the new guy's not invited to. And you don't want to tell him what you were talking about. Or maybe you're talking with a coworker and the boss walks up and says, "What are you all talking about?" And what you were talking about was how you think the boss's new plan is going to be an absolute disaster. And you don't want to tell the boss what you were talking about. Because sometimes when somebody interrupts and says, "What are you talking about?" you are embarrassed or ashamed or worried, and you do not want to talk about what you were talking about. Well, that happened to Jesus' disciples. That happens to Jesus' disciples when Jesus asked them, "What were you talking about?" Now, here's the situation where that comes up. They had been traveling through Galilee, Jesus and his 12 disciples. And not too long before the passage that we read today, we read that Jesus had taken 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, up to a mountaintop. And there he was transfigured. Jesus' robes became glowing white, whiter than snow. And Moses and Elijah joined Jesus. And it was a moment of glory. And James and John and Peter witnessed this amazing moment. And then they came down from that mountaintop that we call the Mount of Transfiguration. And down in the valley, the other 9 disciples had been arguing with the Pharisees, and a man had brought his son who had fits and seizures, and the other 9 hadn't been able to help the man or his son. And Jesus was able to heal the young man when the disciples couldn't. And so there'd been a mountaintop experience, and then there'd been a episode in the valley that was kind of full of arguing and contention and disappointment, and all these things had happened. And now they were traveling around through Galilee, and it says they were headed back to Capernaum, which was Jesus' home base in Galilee. Nazareth, which is where Jesus was from, was a tiny little village. It wasn't big enough to be the home base for Jesus' operations. So the home base became this town called Capernaum. That's where Peter and Andrew and James and John were all from. That's where Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. And I've been fortunate enough now twice when I've gone to the Holy Land to visit this town of Capernaum. And when you go to Capernaum in the Holy Land in Israel, there's even a sign that says, "Welcome to Capernaum, the town of Jesus." And I'll have to tell you, can't pick my favorite place to go in the Holy Land after a couple of times over there. But Capernaum is one of my favorite places because I know how much time Jesus spent there. We know from the scriptures Jesus preached in the synagogue in Capernaum. The ruins of the synagogue of Capernaum are still there. And that's what it looks like. And when you go there and you're standing there, you know you are standing in a place that Jesus stood, which is a pretty awesome feeling. And so it says, Jesus and the disciples had headed back to home base of Capernaum. And they get back, it says they went to the house, probably maybe Peter's house or James and John's house, one of the houses that they operated out of there in Capernaum. And Jesus says to the disciples, "What were you guys talking about on the road?" More specifically, what were you arguing about on the road? I could tell you were arguing. Your voices were loud and angry. What were you talking about as we were walking on the road? Uh-oh. And Mark says this, Mark 9:34, "But they kept quiet, because on the way they had been arguing about who was the greatest." So when Jesus says, "What were you talking about?" they did not want to tell Jesus what they were arguing about. They just kept their mouths shut because what they had been talking about was arguing about which one of them was the greatest. And it's funny how that conversation seemed perfectly appropriate and perfectly acceptable when they thought Jesus wasn't listening. The conversation seemed just fine when they thought, well, Jesus isn't listening. There's all kinds of things that we say, and there's all kinds of things we do when we think, well, nobody is watching. Nobody will see me. Nobody will hear me. Jesus isn't watching this. Jesus isn't hearing what I'm saying. Of course, if we really stop and think, we realize, I guess he is. How much different would some of our words and actions be if we really reminded ourselves constantly that Jesus is watching and listening to what we say and what we do. He hears everything we say and sees everything we do. And that's not a threat. That's not something creepy. Hopefully that's something comforting, that Jesus is always watching over you. Hopefully that is comforting to our spirits and to our souls to think about the fact that Jesus' eyes are on us, and He knows what we're doing. He knows what we're thinking. He knows what we're saying. He watches over us. And I think, the fact that Jesus can see what we're doing and hear what we're saying is either troubling or comforting. If some people think, Jesus is watching me, they get troubled by that. Hopefully for us, when we realize Jesus is walking beside us and traveling with us and watching us, hopefully that's a comforting thought, not a troubling thought. But for the disciples in that moment, when Jesus says, what were you arguing about? They don't want to tell him. And their unwillingness to tell Jesus tells us that they knew he wouldn't like it. He would not like what they had been saying. He wouldn't like their conversation. But of course, Jesus did know what they were talking about. He asked them, but he already knew what they were talking about. Now, Mark doesn't tell us exactly who among the 12 were involved in this argument. We just said the disciples were arguing, but we're not told by Mark exactly which of the 12. If all of them were arguing about this or just a few of them. But we can make some pretty decent guesses based on some other incidents, because Mark tells us about another incident in Mark 10:35-37, where it says this: Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory. James and John had come to Jesus and said, when you come into power, we want to be right next to you. We know that James and John, these two fishermen, were ambitious men. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about why did they follow Jesus, and we believe, one, it was because they'd listened to him teach. Their friends and partners, Peter and Andrew, had become attached to Jesus, and there was that miraculous catch of fish that convinced them that this Jesus was somebody special. But now, James and John they'd seen bigger things. Bigger fish. They'd seen Jesus heal blind people. They'd seen Jesus walk on water. They'd seen Jesus feed thousands of people with one sack lunch. And now they had seen Jesus glorified, transfigured on the mountaintop. They'd seen Jesus talking to Moses and Elijah, and they realized this was no mere rabbi. This was not even a mere prophet. This was a man of power. And they wanted a piece of that. They wanted some of that power. They wanted to be on his right and on his left. They wanted to be his generals. They wanted to be his lieutenants. After all, he only took 3 of them up to the mountaintop, 3 out of the 12. And they thought pretty highly of themselves, that out of the 12 disciples, he picked the 2 of them and Peter to be the ones to witness this miracle. You can imagine maybe what the conversation was on the road. They were, Peter and James and John, telling the other 9, man, you should have seen it. It was amazing. He was glowing. And Elijah and Moses were there. And well, I mean, it's beyond description. I wish we could have all been there. But of course, Jesus picked us, us three, to be the one to witness it. I mean, you know, somebody's got to be at the top. And it looks like the three of us are going to be the main guys, the ones when Jesus comes into power that, well, we can't all be leaders. And we can imagine the reaction of the other 9 or 10 to James and John. Matter of fact, we don't have to imagine it. Mark tells us what the reaction of the other disciples were when they heard about James and John requesting these positions of power. Mark 10:41 says this, "When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John." So there's dissension in the ranks among the disciples. And this is not at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. This is well into Jesus' ministry. This is months and months and months, maybe years into the time with Jesus. And this jockeying for position, this arguing about which one of them was at the top, is mentioned several times in the Gospels, right up to the end, right up to the night before Jesus went to the cross. Because we know the night before Jesus went to the cross, they were arguing again about which one of them was going to wash the feet. Then the argument was not which one is at the top, it was which one of you all is at the bottom, because the low person on the totem pole was the one who was supposed to do the menial tasks, like foot washing. We know that the very night before Jesus went to the cross, his disciples were arguing about which one of them was going to have to do the dirty work, the menial tasks. And so here, when Jesus knows they've been arguing on the road about which one of them is the greatest, Jesus says this is a teachable moment, and he gathers them up. It says this, Mark 9:35, sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last, and the servant of all." Jesus called the 12 and said, "Anyone who wants to be the first must be the very last, and the servant of all." He said the way to lead is by serving. The path to greatness is service. If you want to be first, be last. And I think in our world, often we hear that and we think, well, that's a nice sentiment, but that's unrealistic. That's a nice sentiment, but that's not the way the world works. The way the world works is you claw and scratch and fight your way to the top because you got to be ambitious. Jesus isn't against ambition. He says you have to have ambition to serve. Ambition to serve. Now think about it. Think about the people we will be honoring this week on Veterans Day. Why do we honor them? Because they served. What do you say when you perhaps see a man or woman in uniform? Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. Jesus says if you want to be first, the path to greatness is servanthood. Serving your family, serving your community, serving your country, serving your church, serving your God. And it's this saying, I am ambitious. I have a desire to serve. I want to serve. I want to serve. And the people we tend to hold and honor for generations, the people that we tend to look back and say, there was a great leader, are the people who had a heart for service. We also know how history tends to judge people whose only desire is to seek power, whose only desire is to serve their own ego, whose only desire is to enrich themselves. People who have a thirst for praise and power. Now, this has been going on ever since there's people. And the argument about who's the greatest and the situation that was on the road that day has happened over and over inside the church and outside the church. Back in the Middle Ages, there were some popes in the church who were criminals, like the Borgia family, who treated the papacy like the mafia. And it was all about wealth for their own families and their own illegitimate children. And, hadn't been that long ago that people like Robert Tilton and some of the other TV evangelists were exposed for naked, raw greed and ambition. And all kinds of people in between, whether it was corrupt popes or prosperity preachers who tell you that being a Christian is about getting wealthy and prosperous, and if anything you want, reach out and grab it and name it and claim it. That's why the modern prosperity gospel is so antithetical to the real gospel, so opposite to the teachings of Jesus, where Jesus calls us to humility and servanthood, service. And to make his point, Jesus, as if the disciples, the 12, when he called them to kind of say, I know what you're arguing about, and here's why your argument over which one of you is the greatest is so opposite to everything I've been saying and teaching you and teaching the crowds. He calls a child. He gets a little kid. Who knows? I mean, he's there in Capernaum. It might have been a child, one of the kids related to one of the 12, and he puts that child on his lap, and he says, if you welcome a child, you welcome me. And if you welcome me, you welcome the one who sent me. Children had no power in the first century. Helping a child wouldn't get you famous or rich or powerful. Matter of fact, most of the things Jesus commands us to do don't make you rich or powerful. And Jesus tells us to do things like feed the hungry, and clothe those who don't have clothes, and welcome the stranger, and visit the sick, and the prisoner, and all those things Jesus commands us to do. You say, well, that won't make me rich. That won't give me prestige. No, because Jesus' way, Jesus' path to being first is different from the one that the world tends to lay out for us. He says, if you want to be first, be a servant. And that may not make you powerful in the eyes of the world, but it will make you first in the kingdom. First in the kingdom. The path to being first, he says, is to lower yourself, humble yourself, and serve. And serve those who are powerless, a child. The path to being first is to be a servant. We think of the people that are sort of the most prominent Christian leaders of each generation. And before there was Rick Warren, there was Billy Graham. And before Billy Graham, there were others. But in the late 1800s, the most famous preacher in the world was named D.L. Moody. He was the most dynamic and the most well-known preacher in America and even all across Europe. And this is in an age before microphones. Moody would preach to 25,000 people. Think about that in a world before microphones. Moody would preach to huge revivals, huge evangelistic efforts all over America, all over Europe. And he became known all around the world as this incredible preacher, incredible organizer. He was the most famous preacher in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And because he was so well known, he had a conference here in the States where he invited pastors from all over Europe to come and learn from him. And so all these pastors and church leaders from all over the world are gathered in an American hotel for this conference. Now, all the European pastors that night in the hotel took their shoes and put them outside the hotel door. Because in Europe, in the late 1800s, the hall servants would shine your shoes every night. They didn't realize in America we didn't have hall servants. So all these European pastors put their shoes outside their hotel room doors, expecting the hall servants to shine their shoes. D.L. Moody saw this, and he mentioned to a couple of young pastors, maybe it would be nice if somebody shined those shoes. But these young pastors somehow had something else to do. So D.L. Moody, the most famous pastor in the world, took those shoes to his hotel room and that night shined those shoes. He didn't tell anybody about it, but one person saw him and the word got out what he had done. Because he had the heart of a servant. Even though he was big name, evangelist, leading the conference, all that kind of stuff. He didn't draw any attention to himself. He just decided to do an act of servanthood. And I think one of the reasons he was so successful was because he had that heart. And if we are going to be first in the kingdom, Jesus says, be last, be the servant of all. Take the posture of a servant if you want to be great. Let's pray.